Hi, and welcome to Unit 2, Lecture 3, as part of our continuing unit on ethics. Today we're going to be looking at moral objectivism, using Morality is Not Relative by James Rachels. Now, like last time, today's lecture is going to follow this sort of pattern or roadmap. We're first going to go over a brief recap of the previous things we talked about, talking about both the debate and the general positions contained in it, as well as the sort of arguments given by Ruth Benedict in the previous reading. We're then going to move on to an overview of Rachels' own argument, and sort of the skeleton that Rachels follows as he moves through his argument. We're then going to go into a detailed analysis of those positions and Rachels' own support and evidence for those positions. And then we're going to end with sort of a set of guidelines and things to keep in mind when evaluating whether or not Rachels is correct. Now, let's just go ahead and get to it, shall we? To recap on some of the previous topics, we're looking into whether morality is objective or relative. That is, as a fundamental question about ethics and morality and all those sorts of nice things. Now, there were three possible positions, three possible answers to this question. Moral objectivism, the idea that there are such things as moral standards, universal objective moral standards. Moral relativity, that says that there are moral standards, but they depend on people's individual beliefs or culture. And last, moral skepticism, the idea that there are no objective moral standards, or any moral standards at all, that we can be aware of or know. Now, last time we looked at an argument for moral relativism, and by extension moral skepticism, called the argument from disagreement, using Ruth Benedict's version as an example. The argument from disagreement uses the existence of significant disagreement about moral issues as evidence against the existence of any objective, universal moral standards or facts. Now, it's also an argument for relativism because it still argues that there are moral standards. It just says that they're relative to and dependent on the beliefs of each individual culture. And it generally argues that what's morally good is a shorthand for accepted by society. Now, if you take it a little bit further, you can use the argument in support of moral skepticism, but mainly Benedict focused on and supported moral relativism. Now, today we're going to be looking at the other side of this debate. We're going to be looking at moral objectivism, and this is the view that there are objective moral standards and facts. Now, there are many, many, many varieties of moral objectivism, most of which differ about the nature of the standards that exist. Some, for example, argue for what's sometimes called absolutism, the idea that there are objective moral standards and they apply to all people at all times, regardless of circumstances. This is the sort of thing like thou shalt not kill. What part of that did you not understand? Or so the bumper stickers say. It's the idea that killing is wrong no matter what circumstances you're in. Others argue for different versions of particularism, that there are different rules for different situations, and in some extreme versions, they say that you can never make any moral rules at all, because everything is different for every individual circumstance, and so while there are moral facts, they differ from every moment to moment, and most others fall in between those. Some others argue for consequentialist theories that say that the consequences of an action are what are most important. Some are against these. Some argue for versions of divine command theory in which God tells human beings and decides what is morally right and wrong as an objective matter of fact, and so on and so forth. So there's a lot of different versions of objectivism. And we're not going to be talking about any one in particular. Instead, we're going to be talking about the idea that unifies them and unites them as objectivism. And that is the notion that regardless of what people think, some things simply are right or wrong. So if killing an innocent person is wrong in situation X, and every culture on Earth were still okay with killing innocents in situation X, then every culture on Earth is mistaken. They're wrong about the way morality actually is, if you're an objectivist. An objectivist is somebody who believes that there are moral facts about the universe in the same way that there are physical facts. Even if nobody believed them or nobody knew about them, those facts are still true. They're objectively true. They're true independent of what people believe or think about them. Now, this is different from relativism, Because relativism says that, if we're still giving the killing innocents example, that killing innocents would only be wrong if either the culture or individuals believed it was, depending on what version of relativism you're talking about. Now, because moral standards are dependent on, that is, they're relative to, either cultures or individuals, if no one at all believes something was wrong, it wouldn't be. So take the killing of innocents. If no one on earth believed that killing an innocent person in situation X is wrong, it wouldn't be, because that standard only exists because it's believed by either a culture or an individual, depending on what you think's right. Now, James Rachel's essay, Morality is Not Relative, kind of does exactly what it says in the title, and it argues against relativism, and by extension, defends objectivism. While he doesn't give any hardcore arguments for objective morality, that is, he never explicitly says, you should believe in objective morality because, he still offers a lot of arguments that defend objectivism. Because while you can reject relativism and not be an objectivist, the arguments that Rachel's uses do still support it. In particular, Rachel's critiques the arguments from disagreement and attempts to show why objectivism is a better alternative to relativism, particularly when it comes to explaining, say, disagreement and some of the implications and things that surround it. Now, Rachel's article is divided into 7 short sections, each separated by topic. And, just for the record, you haven't seen any other philosophy articles yet, rather than these past 2. But I want you to take a moment and appreciate the fact that this one is very clearly organized with section headers and all the rest of it. In the future, you may very much be wishing for this, so I want you to take a moment and appreciate it now. Now, each of these sections tackles a different task. The first part 1, gives an example of moral disagreement. So it sort of does similar things to Benedict's argument. Section 2 presents the kinds of conclusions that are usually drawn from moral disagreement. Part 3 presents a version of the argument from disagreement that he calls the cultural differences argument, and then he argues that it's unsound. Section 4 discusses the negative implications of relativism and why objectivism is better. Part 5, he argues that there's actually less disagreement than it seems, and 6 shows that there are some values that are actually universal across different cultures and different time periods. And then in part 7 argues that while relativism is false, it still has some important insights that are of value to all people, including moral objectivists. That is, there are some things that you can learn from relativism, even if you think that it's false. So while some of these parts are very useful to read, and you should go and read them, do the readings, in this lecture, we'll be skipping any discussion about parts 1 and 2. Essentially, they just recap the same kind of material that was in Benedict's piece. And while there's no significant disagreement between the two, I don't see a lot of point in going back into it. Rachel's gives us an excellent and succinct overview of the kinds of position that a relativist might take away from disagreement and cultural difference, and Rachel's summary agrees with the things that Benedict said. So honestly, we just don't need to spend time going back over it. If you need a refresher, go back and watch the previous lecture. We'll spend the most time in this lecture on parts 3 and 4, with some attention scattered throughout to the others as well. Because the reason for this is that 3 and 4 is where the majority of the philosophically interesting work is being done in the article, with 5, 6, and 7 sort of giving support to the main point made in 3 and 4. So this is all the more reason why you should go and do the readings yourself. I won't always talk about every aspect of an essay, simply just due to time or the amount of material covered in the reading. You're still responsible for everything in the reading. You're liable to be asked about it on a quiz or a journal prompt. But in the lectures, we'll be mainly hitting the highlights and trying to give a detailed analysis of the workhorses, the really fundamental and core parts of an essay. So for a truly in-depth understanding, something that you'll need for some of your exams or future assessments, you need to still do the readings yourself. Alright, so let's go ahead and start moving into the detailed analysis of what's going on in Rachel's article. In part 3, Rachels presents his formulation of a general version of the cultural differences argument, which we previously called the argument from disagreement. The two are the exact same thing. Now, Rachels' cultural disagreements argument goes like this. Different cultures have different moral codes. Therefore, there is no objective truth in morality. Right and wrong are only matters of opinion, and opinions vary from culture to culture. If we read this, keeping in mind that these opinions that we're talking about are deeply held and products of powerful cultural forces and are core beliefs of the people who hold them, then this would be an accurate rendition of the argument we saw in the Benedict reading. It's a little more general, it's less detailed, and I might would have used a different word than opinion to actually capture the kinds of things we're talking about, but it makes the same basic point. So essentially this is the same as our argument from disagreement, so we can apply Rachels' critiques to both discussions. Now, Rachels, after posing this version of the argument, goes into the same kind of question we actually asked ourselves at the end of the last lecture. Is this argument sound? And to give you the short version, he argues that it isn't. Remember that for an argument to be sound, it needs to be both valid and have both true premises and a true conclusion. That is, it's a valid argument with true premises and true conclusions. All the parts must be true, and the conclusion must follow from the premises. That is, the truth of the conclusion has to be based on, it has to come from the truth of the premises. The conclusion needs to be true because the premises are true. There's got to be that tight conceptual connection going on. Now, Rachels argues that the conclusion of the cultural differences argument, that there is no objective truth in morality, that this doesn't follow from the premises. The premises just, they might be true, but they aren't the reason why the conclusion would be true. One side of the, when we're talking about moral disagreements, it's entirely possible that one of the two cultures is simply mistaken, for example. It may be, suppose that you have two cultures that differ about the treatment of the dead, I think is one of the examples that Rachels talks about. If culture A says you should treat the dead one way, and culture B says you should treat the dead another way, then that doesn't mean that there is no objectively correct way to treat the dead. It's also possible that culture A could simply be mistaken, or culture B is. The fact that there is disagreement doesn't guarantee, doesn't ensure or necessitate that there is no objective moral standards. Another way to ram this point home is to consider something that's not about moral facts. Consider the following argument. There is significant disagreement about whether the Earth is round or flat. Therefore, whether the Earth is flat is simply a matter of cultural opinion. There is no truth about whether the Earth is round or flat. Now, if you've had any sort of basic science education at all, you should see that this is obviously unsound. The fact that people disagree about the shape of the Earth does not imply that there is no truth about the subject. It doesn't guarantee that there is no matter of fact about whether the Earth is round or flat. We know that it's got to be one or the other, and thankfully we now know, thanks to the work of past human scientists and mathematicians, that the Earth is actually round, regardless of what people think about it. But because the flat Earth and the cultural differences arguments use the same kind of reasoning, and one is obviously unsound, we can accurately consider the other unsound as well. In fact, we should think this way. The form of the argument is such, and the kind of reasoning is such, that we shouldn't treat the cultural differences argument as a good argument. It's obviously making the same kind of mistake that the flat Earth argument does. Now, this doesn't directly mean that relativism's false, though. Instead, this just means that we shouldn't treat the cultural differences argument, the argument from disagreement, as a convincing one. It's possible that even though this is a bad argument, relativism's still true. I can give a terrible, terrible argument that Barack Obama is the current president. I might say, well, if my shoe is untied, then Barack Obama is president. My shoe is untied, therefore Barack Obama is president. Now, it's true that Barack Obama is president, but that's a terrible, terrible argument for believing that that's true. I shouldn't treat it as convincing. I shouldn't use that argument as reasons to believe that Barack Obama is the current president of the United States. But, it still doesn't mean that he's not. So, even though the cultural differences argument's a bad argument, it's still worthwhile to consider if there's some other reasons for thinking that moral relativism is either true or false. And so Rachel's goes on to consider, what are the implications of moral relativism? Does it commit us to other positions that we can or can't rationally accept? And if that might seem like a strange move, remember that we did briefly address this kind of strategy in the last lecture. But if you're still not quite on board with it, consider. Suppose that you have got a friend. I hope you've got several. But suppose you hear that your friend lost a fight at school yesterday, and you don't know whether or not that's true. It seems like it could be, but you really don't know. Now, you do know from seeing him earlier today that your friend has no injuries at all, and that if he'd lost a fight, he would have had at least some small wound on him somewhere. It's very rare for people to lose fights and not get hurt in some way. Now, because the possibility that he was in a fight implies something that you know is false, then you can safely believe that he is not in a fight. If he'd been in that fight, it would require you to believe that he has wounds and injuries on him somewhere. You know that that's false. Because of that, you can safely believe that he wasn't in a fight. So the implications helped you settle a question you didn't know the answer to. We can do something similar for the moral relativism position. Rachel's is going to consider 3 different implications that he says we shouldn't accept because we know that they're false. That is, they're things that we think are crazy kinds of thoughts. And thus, these implications give us reason to reject moral relativism. The implications give us extra evidence for rejecting the thing we don't know the answer to. Now, the implications he considers are the following. We could no longer say, if moral relativism were true, we could no longer say that the customs of other societies are morally inferior to ours. If relativism were true, we also couldn't decide whether actions are right or wrong just by we could decide whether actions were right or wrong just by consulting the standards of our own society. And if moral relativism is true, then the idea of moral progress is called into doubt. Each of these 3 implications appeal to beliefs that most people already hold, and they think that they believe rightly. And most people agree that they do believe rightly. And it points out that we need to abandon these beliefs that we think are true in favor of false beliefs if we endorse moral relativism. Now, if this seems a little odd, we're going to go into detail about these. So why are each of these implications bad? Well, let's look at them. The first implication says that if moral relativism were true, then we could no longer say that the customs of other societies are morally inferior. And at some quick glance, that seems like that might be a good thing. If there is no universal independent moral standard by which we can judge moral beliefs as being correct or incorrect, then it becomes impossible for us to say that some moral codes are right and other codes are wrong. And at first glance, that seems like a kind of reasonable modern view to have. It stops us from judging others, it stops us from condemning people we don't know, and so that seems like a rather sophisticated, tolerant position to take. But the problem arises when we start considering other things, when we start considering cultural beliefs or moral beliefs about things like racism, the Holocaust, or slavery, according to Rachel's. If relativism were true, and what's actually right and wrong depends entirely on what a culture believes, and we thought that cultural relativism was true, then we couldn't consistently or rationally say that a tolerant society is better than an intolerant society, or that a society that did not treat women as people is worse than one in which women have equal rights. In order to do that kind of independent judgment, in order to do that sort of comparison, you need an independent standard, a universal objective standard, by which you can do that comparison. You can say that cultural A thinks that women should be people, or that women are people. Cultural B says that women are not people, and our independent standard says whether or not A or B is right. If you don't have that sort of independent standard, at most, all you can say is that culture B doesn't follow the standards set by culture A. But if relativism is true, then we know that the standards of culture A don't apply to culture B, because culture B has its own standards, and its own standards are the only ones that apply to it, because morality is different depending on your culture. So, at most we could say that the society violates norms that don't apply to them. Now, that's obviously something that a lot of us don't want to be able to say. We don't want to have to say that racism isn't a good thing. But there's other problems as well. If morality is determined by our culture, then whenever we need to know if something's right or wrong, then we can simply check to see whether or not it's acceptable by our culture. And this is what Rachel's is talking about with his second implication. So let's think about this. If morality is determined by the norms of our own culture, of each culture, then our culture's standards are what should be the basis of our beliefs of right and wrong, because they're the standards that actually apply to us. Therefore, whenever we want to find out if something's right or wrong, we just check against the only standards that apply, our culture's standards. But this seems wrong. Very few of us think that our societies are perfect, that they have the actual say on what's right and wrong. Pretty much everybody can think of different ways in which our society could be improved, and not just improved, but improved morally. If, for example, we lived in a racist culture, then we would have no moral justification for saying that racism is wrong, because the only standards that apply would be the ones of our culture. Since that's the way things are, there wouldn't be any universal neutral standard. Therefore, if we lived in such a culture, we would have no moral justification for saying that racism is wrong. There might be practical reasons, or we might say that we believe that it's wrong, but we couldn't actually say that it's morally the case, that racism would be morally wrong because of the way human rights and dignity and the rest are. So without an independent universal standard, Rachels argues, not only can we not criticize other cultures morally, we couldn't criticize our own culture. And this kind of leads to a connected sort of third implication. If cultural relativism is true, according to Rachels, then the very concept of moral progress seems impossible. If there's no such thing as an independent moral standard, then it's impossible for a society to improve morally. All they can do is become different. They can switch which variations of human society they manifest. But most of us tend to think that we have made significant improvements morally as a society. For example, and I'm speaking of American culture here, since it's the one that I belong to, it's the one in which I'm teaching, or at least it's the context in which I'm teaching. Well, in American society, we no longer deny half the population the right to vote. People are no longer considered the property of other people. We don't believe that some families are inherently better than others because of things like rights of nobility or divine mandates. And there's a whole host of other beliefs that we no longer hold as a society. Most of us tend to think that at least American Western society has made significant moral progress. It's not perfect. We still screw up on an awful lot of things, an awful lot of very serious things. But there's at least some things in which we have improved on. But if there's no universal moral standard, then we can't say such a thing. There's no standard by which to make that comparison. Instead, all that would happen was the standards that applied to our society changed. And so it was right then, but it may not be right now. And that seems like a weird thing to say. If slavery is wrong now, it seems like it should have been wrong at all time. It should have been wrong then because it was violating the same kinds of things that it violates now. So, this implication, like the first two, seems to give us a good reason, according to Rachel's, to reject moral relativism. Now, with all of these implications, Rachel's never explicitly says that we should endorse objectivism. But all of these implications seem to support objectivism over relativism. Rachel's is essentially arguing that we should reject implications 1 through 3 because we already believe they're opposites. And those opposites require objectivism to make any sense. So, like, for example, most of us do believe in moral progress, but we can only believe in moral progress if we have a universal moral standard. a standard of human rights and dignity regardless of what the society believed. Therefore, because we already believe the opposites of these implications, and because those opposites are things that we think are true, then we should reject the source of these false implications. We should reject moral relativism. Remember, these implications aren't saying that we should pretend that there's a universal standard, or that we should create a universal standard. These implications are saying that we have reason to think that it's already true that there is, in fact, such a thing as a universal moral standard. I keep stressing these kinds of points because this is a common misconception that students often have, that people often have when talking about objective morality. It's not that we just think that there is universal moral standards, it's that we should think and that we're correct in thinking that there are universal objective moral standards. So, that's that segment of the article. What about the others? Well, in parts 5 and 6, Rachels points out that despite how it appears, the data of anthropologists actually shows that there's less moral disagreement than you might initially think, and that there are some values that are actually universal across cultures and across time periods. Each of these points don't directly prove objectivism, but they do help undermine the argument from cultural differences, or the argument from disagreement, you might call it. And these sections are rather straightforward. There's no complicated philosophical moves here. He argues that upon closer inspection, that if you keep looking at the data about disagreement, what appears to be moral disagreement about moral principles is instead only differences in applications. So, like, for example, Eskimos often kill infants, or not often, but sometimes kill infants as a last resort. And so, initially, an anthropologist or a relativist might take this as evidence that, well, Eskimos think that it's okay to kill children. We don't. Therefore, here's an example of significant moral disagreement. Here's evidence that seems to count against the idea of a universal moral standard. But Rachels points out that if you dig deeper into the anthropological information here, the information about how their culture is, then you'd see that there's really not so much difference anymore. You see, the Eskimos sometimes kill infants only as a last resort to protect the survival of the tribe, because infants are a large drain on resources. They take a large commitment of time and energy and nutrients that, in times of starvation or low food, would make it very difficult for the society as a whole to survive. Therefore, when they kill children, when they commit infanticide, is the term that Rachels uses, they're not disvaluing human life. You know, that seems like it would be the point of disagreement, that one group values human life and one group doesn't, because they kill children. But really, the Eskimos don't disvalue human life. They still value it very, very much. They're just living in extreme circumstances that give them reason to think that the right thing to do is to commit these very undesirable acts. And in fact, Rachels goes on to point out that these different cultures not only don't disagree on things, but they share a lot of these values in common. See, the Eskimos still very much treasure their children, and killing infants is only a last resort. It's still very common, in fact more common, to give these children to infertile couples and to help spread around the burden of taking care of them. They want these kids to live, and they want human life to continue on as much as possible. And these types of values like valuing human life, protecting your children, things like this, appear in almost every society. Rachels even argues that some of these values are necessary for society to exist. A society that wasn't peaceful, that didn't have some sort of structure or government and didn't value its children, wouldn't be a society for very long at all. In order to survive, in order to exist, a society has to accept at least some bare minimum set of values. And these values are shared universally among people. So, what's the takeaway from all this? Rachels is arguing that relativism isn't true. He's saying that the cultural differences argument is false, and that this gives us reason to think that relativism itself is false. But Rachel still thinks that relativism seems plausible for a reason. and therefore there's actually some things that even a moral objectivist can take away from it. Rachels argues that relativism does capture some very important insights that should influence our moral thinking. First off, it wisely points out that we shouldn't assume that any of our practices, any of our moral beliefs, are better than those of other cultures. For one, some things that we disagree on and that we find shocking might not be moral questions at all. In other situations, it may be us that's incorrect, us that are mistaken about what's morally right. And relativism, with its emphasis on the amount of disagreement and the idea that things are not so straightforward, morally black and white as we think, is a very, very powerful and important lesson for us to learn. And it helps stress this kind of information. And it's something that even a moral objectivist should take to heart. An objectivist shouldn't assume that they've got all the moral questions figured out and that they've got all the answers. Instead, they should consider that other societies, other cultures may have the correct answers, and that some things may not be moral questions at all. That may be irrelevant. It may not be something that is morally right or wrong. It's just different. And a second but related point is that cultural relativism teaches us that we should keep an open mind. Not everything that seems right or wrong to our culturally influenced selves actually is. By pointing out how many of our moral beliefs come just from our culture, rather than being based on any sort of first principle foundational idea like human rights or human dignity or fairness, when you point out how many of our beliefs come from culture, we should start to be a little more cautious about the sort of things that we consider to be moral absolutes. We should start to ask ourselves, do I believe this because it's actually morally right, or do I believe it just because my culture tells me that it is? And these are questions that any rational or philosophically minded person, any person who really cares about getting the right answer, should really be asking themselves. Now, for the sake of time, we won't go through every argument that Rachel's has given us. We've gone through what the arguments say, but it's come to the point in the lecture and the point in our thinking in which we need to start evaluating whether or not Rachel's is correct. He's given us a lot of very plausible sounding reasons, but so did Benedict. And so each of these arguments that he makes, the arguments about the implications, about the unsoundness of the cultural differences argument, all of these things deserve evaluation. However, we're not going to take the time in this lecture to go through every single one of those things. Because, let's face it, there's a lot of arguments on the table right now. So I'll leave a lot of the evaluation to you. And your journal topic this week should actually help you cover a lot of that evaluating and get you going on it. But while you do so, there's a few questions that I want you to keep in mind. For one, do any of Rachel's critiques of relativism have good responses? Could somebody like Benedict or another relativist actually defend themselves against Rachel's points? If they could, then it may still be the case that relativism is true. If they can answer the kinds of objections that Rachel's raises, then they've got good reasons for believing in relativism despite the problems Rachel's points out. So I want you to think about, could a relativist defend themselves? And if so, how might they do it? If you're skeptical about it, see if you can imagine ways. What would it take for a relativist to defend their beliefs? Second, I want you to keep in mind and be asking yourself, could the argument from cultural differences be rewritten to express the same idea, but avoid Rachel's criticisms? Is there a way to believe in a version of the cultural differences argument, but still avoid the kinds of problems that Rachel's points out in the first sections of his article? And I also, in particular, want you to consider, should we really reject the implications of relativism? Or would it be more correct to instead reject our own beliefs about progress and moral comparison? It might be that we already are believing the crazy implications, and instead we should endorse the kinds of things that are implied by relativism. Again, this is one of those kinds of lessons that Rachel's is pointing out that relativism teaches us. We might be the ones that are mistaken. We might need to be reevaluating things. and what we think is rationally warranted might not actually be so. So these are things to keep in mind as you go forward and do the evaluations yourself. At this point, I'll leave you to your own thinking. Happy arguing, happy reading.